Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host and resident oceanographer, climatologist Jim Massa. So, I have brought to you in the past videos discussing, outlining, detailing the issue of plastics in aquatic ecosystems, especially the oceans. We talked about plastics. Plastics have been found everywhere from the Arctic Ocean all the way down to Mariana's Trench. So they're everywhere. Well, look at this title here. This comes from the online publication, Environmental Health News, and this was just published the end of August 31st. Microplastics in farm soils, a growing concern. Now, I'm sure growing was meant as a pun here. Researchers say that more microplastics pollution is getting into farm soil than oceans. And we know into oceans, that's a big problem. These tiny bits are showing up in our fruits, veggies, and bodies. Okay, so let's get into this here. Mary Beth Kirkham hadn't studied microplastics when she was invited to co-edit a new book about microplastics in the environment, but something stood out to her about the existing research. Dr. Kirkham is a plant physiologist. She's a distinguished professor of agronomy at Kansas State University. And she stated, I had read in the literature that cadmium and other toxic trace elements are increased when we have these particular plastics in the soil. So that was of concern to me. Cadmium does very nasty things to plants. Let's put it at that. Certain conditions can increase their solubility so that more readily absorbed through the roots, where havoc is then created for the plant. So her expertise is in water, plant relations, and heavy metal uptake. Cadmium goes into solution, the roots uptake it, right, through the water absorption. So she decided to conduct her own research in which she cultivated wheat plants exposed to microplastics, cadmium, both microplastics and cadmium, that's looking for interactive effects. I have discussed before how oftentimes if you have several independent variables, one of the things you need to look for are any potential interactions between those independent variables. That's what she's doing here. Then she compared these plants to those grown without either additive, in other words, a control group. She chose cadmium because it's poisonous, carcinogenic, and ubiquitous everywhere in the environment due to human activity. It's shed from batteries, car tires, naturally found in the phosphate rock used to make agricultural fertilizers. It's everywhere. This is her right here on the left. So at the end of the experiment, she sent her wheat plants to be analyzed. The plants grown with microplastics were more cadmium contaminated. The plastics were acting as the vector for the uptake of the cadmium. And then her experiment became a chapter in the new book, Particulate Plastics in Terrestrial and Aquatic Environments. I think people just haven't felt that microplastic uptake by plants is an issue. It just hasn't been in the public eye. So again, this is a photo of her in her lab with a student, most likely, and at Kansas State University. That's a balanced scale there. That's one that's extremely precise. That one probably taking it down to maybe nanograms. I don't know. I don't see the front of it, but they're very precise machines there. Microplastics are loosely defined as plastic pieces smaller than 5 millimeters across. So you can see 5 millimeters. I mean, that's like a grain of rice size. Roughly the size of a small grain of rice. They made the mark in the global ecosystem and the popular consciousness, famously killing seabirds and raining down in wilderness areas. Now, ocean microplastics have been noted, studied, reported on. I certainly have done that in my videos, but this is the first time we're seeing, this is my first time reporting on the problems as it relates to plants, relates to agriculture, relates to our food. Yes, in the ocean, if you eat a fish, you could be ingesting the plastic because the fish had probably ingested the plastic. I did a recent two-part, I've done a whole bunch of videos on plastic, but my most recent one was a two-parter, and the second part shows larval fish ingesting plastic. Please check out that video and look at the video within the video to see that footage. It's quite alarming. One estimate suggested that 107,000 to 730,000 tons of microplastics could be dumped onto agriculturals in the soils in the U.S. and Europe every year, compared to the 93,000 to 236,000 tons that enter the oceans. So if you look at the upper end, it's not quite 3 times more going into the soil than into the oceans. So how do microplastics get into the farms in the first place? Through processed sewage sludge used for fertilizer, plastic mulches that even intentionally added as a slow-release fertilizer and protective seed coatings. In just the last few years, an uptick in research has uncovered alarming potential impact of this contamination on all aspects of agricultural systems, from soil quality to human health. I just want to make a little comment here. The notion of protective seed coating. Here's that little geoengineering, although they're not going to call it that because it's not, quote unquote, directly related to climate change. But geoengineering isn't just about climate change. It's about other aspects. It could be about increasing food yields and so on. It could be about mitigating whatever it might be. So here they're trying to think, let's help, protect the seeds so that grow and germinate and all that kind of stuff. This is an example of unexpected, unintended, unaccounted consequences taking place. This is why these things need to be carefully studied. And when you try to do, such schemes on a large scale, you better be careful. I've discussed in other video segments, why I think geoengineering, when related to climate change, is foolhardy. This is definitely a situation where with unexpected consequences. So there's a photo of a little patch here. Microplastics can also enter agricultural soils through the degradation of plastic materials used by farmers, such as black plastic mulch, which is what you see here. Right? They put this material over here, and you get some germination through the weaves of the plastic, but that this stuff will degrade. Usually UV light will degrade it, and then that gets into the system. Okay, so let's continue on here. Luca Nizzetto, a research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, began studying microplastics in agricultural soils after he noticed that most research on microplastics focused on oceans. And this is what prompted him to look at agricultural soils. Most of the marine sources are actually land-based. So no one was looking at what was happening close to the source. He decided to. Makes perfect sense. When his team began evaluating potential land sinks for microplastics, they immediately identified agriculture as one of the hot areas. So we know microplastics can enter agricultural lands via sewage sludge, the solids that are filtered out of wastewater, which commonly used to fertilize agricultural fields. I wonder if that practice is now going to be reevaluated. Microplastics get into the wastewater originally through laundry, personal care products, urban runoff. Nizzetto said that most of the microplastics are retained in the sludge as the water is cleaned in treatment facilities. And in the 2016 paper, his team estimated that between 125 and 850 tons per million people are annually dumped on European agricultural lands via sewage sludge. He also reported in the same paper that roughly 50% of sewage sludge is processed for agricultural application in both Europe and the US. Microplastics have been reported in US sewage sludge as early as 1998. In 2020, researchers estimated roughly 21,249 metric tons of microplastics are released to U.S. agricultural lands from sewage sludge annually. Because of their recalcitrance in soils, U.S. researchers have even investigated the possibility of using the contemporary microplastic profile of soils as an indicator of past sewage sludge application. In other words, trying to create a historical profile. Makes sense. Microplastics can also enter agricultural soils through the degradation of plastic materials used by farmers. Kirkham said that in the 1950s, plastic covering replaced glass in greenhouses. Okay, so plastic covering. In the old greenhouses, you had glass, and they were eventually replaced by plastic. Plastic is opaque, so the sunlight energy go through it. The opaqueness, I guess, helps keep the heat in. But one of the advantages of using the plastic was that come wintertime, you can just take it down, and you don't have to worry about a snow load collapsing the structure down. Plastic mulches were also popularized, becoming commonplace across much of the world. These mulches, which are sheets of plastic like we saw in a photograph a moment ago, laid out on the ground to suppress weeds, warm the soil. That's why they're black, so black absorbs the heat energy, retains moisture. You get the condensation on the underside. They're challenging to recycle and costly to dispose of. According to Kirkham, farmers may end up piling them up on their land or burning them to avoid disposal costs. Nizzetto said that in some areas, the mulches are simply left to break down into the soil, which then creates its own problems. Intentionally manufactured microplastics are another source of microplastic emissions to agricultural soils, according to Nizzetto and other researchers that EHN spoke with. These can include plastic encapsulated slow-release fertilizers, plastic coatings intended to protect seeds from microorganisms. A 2017 report compiled for the European Commission estimates that up to 8,000 metric tons of plastic from slow-release fertilizers are broadcast onto Western European agricultural soils annually, although they said that a percentage of this may not be microplastics. A 2019 European Chemicals Agency report listed emission amounts as 10,000 metric tons for slow-release fertilizers, 500 metric tons for treated seeds every year. Figures for the U.S. were not available. So we're looking at reports from 2017, 2019, and we do not have figures for the U.S. available. Oh, here's a picture of a farmer running a piece of machinery. So here's the some of the deleterious aspects of it. Microplastics alter the physical and biological properties of soils. If you're altering those properties, you're going to affect how the plants grow, you're going to affect plant nutrition, and then ultimately that means human nutrition. 16 days into Kirkham's microplastic cadmium experiment, her plastic-treated wheat plants began to yellow and wilt. Water had been pooling on the top of the soil in the plastic-treated plants, but to keep her experiment consistent, she had to give all the plants the same amount of water. In other words, this is a control. You want to make sure that that all the other variables that the plants are exposed to in this situation are the same. because if you have different watering levels, as in this example here, that could be an effect onto the response seen. But if all the plants have the same amount of water, then water can be eliminated as causing any significant differences in the response seen. So when you conduct control experiments as such, the only thing you want to vary is that which you are studying. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was looking at the effects of dichromate salts on brook trout fingerlings, what it did to their tissue, their growth, and so on. So I had a bank of tanks set up, and I went sampling the river because dichromate salts is the result of effluent from leather tannery operations. So I was specifically looking at hexavalent chromium, which is it's a pretty nasty shit. And so I had tanks, battery of fish, control fish, no exposure at all to chromium. Then I had several treatment levels, a small amount, as in milligrams per liter, a concentration, an intermediate amount, and then a very high amount, which typically reflected the values seen close to the effluent, was discharge, further downstream, and then even further downstream. I made sure that the water temperature was the same, the water pH was the same, all the water chemistry was the same, all the anions, cations levels were the same. I made sure everything was the same, so that the only difference that would be causing any changes in my response was the level of chromium, and then compared to the control fish. Because if any of those things varied, then that could affect the metabolism, that can affect their physiology, and then that could lead, it basically introduces an error into your results in your analysis. So you have to control all of that. And also I was controlling light levels. So the light levels were the same as well, because light levels affect fish physiology. And we can actually, in some fish species, the fish will actually lay down what's called daily otolith growth. Otoliths are ear bones. You have to see a daily deposition. So everything has to be controlled. And that's what Dr. Kirkham's doing here. So what happens here? The particulate plastic appeared to clog the soil pores, prevent aeration of the soil, causing the roots to die. Plants without microplastics, even the cadmium-contaminated ones, did better. It was the plastics that were controlling the growth more than the cadmium. Interesting. Now, I'd be curious to know what the level of cadmium was in these experiments. I would imagine it would be the same for the cadmium only, as well as the cadmium plus plastics setup. But I would venture to guess that the levels used were levels reflected levels found in the environment. Another team of researchers reported similar results. They found that exposure to plastics resulted in reduced weight, height, chlorophyll content, and root growth of Arabidopsis thaliana. Arabidopsis thaliana. Not familiar with the genus species names of plants, which is a relative of cabbage and broccoli. In this study, the researchers used nanoplastics, which are plastic pieces that are less than 100 nanometers in size, basically microscopic. They call it microplastics. No, it's not microscopic plastic. Microplastic, 5 millimeters or smaller. So it's still visible to the naked eye. Nanoplastics are 100 nanometers in size. That's 0.1 microns. Right? Micron or micrometer is 10 to the minus 6. A nanometer is 10 to the minus 9. So you can get your orders of magnitude squared away. So nanoplastics are definitely, you need magnification to see them. And they throw in this way for scale, the novel coronavirus measures 60 to 140 nanometers. That's the virus that causing the COVID situation. If you're reducing the chlorophyll content, you're reducing photosynthetic rates. No photosynthesis, no primary productivity. The plant cannot take the CO2 in the water and make glucose and give off oxygen. So that's very alarming find. This is important findings here. The full impact of microplastics contamination in agricultural soils, particularly as concentrations increase with time, is unknown. However, studies have shown that microplastics possess physical, chemical characteristics that have the potential to alter soil bulk density, microbial communities, water holding capacity, and other properties that influence plant development. Here is a very interesting graph showing cumulative global plastics production 1950 to 2015. So that's basically what, 65-year time period. So you can see the scale here, 0 to 7 billion tons. That's the English way of writing tons. And here's your years. And as you can see, it's exponential. And what I like about this interactive graph is as you slide along here, you can get a specific amount for any year you might be interested in. So if I want to look at 1969, 214 million tons. Okay. Now let's bring it over to, say, 2013. Almost 7.1 billion tons, so 3 orders of magnitude more. 200 million, so it's maybe 1 order of magnitude more. But you can see it's exponentially increasing. Now, if you want, the URL is right up here, ehn.org/plastic in farm, soil, and food, a bunch of hyphens in between. I'm sure if you typed in just that amount there, you'd be able to pull up this report, and then you could we engage with this graphic here. Now they looked at what happened with earthworms. Impacts on earthworms. Earthworms are very important for soils. Esperanza Hureta Luanga, a soil scientist affiliated with both Wageningen University and research in the Netherlands and El Colegio de la Frontera Sur in Mexico, has investigated the effects of microplastics on earthworms. And their activities through the soil help aerate the soil. And earthworms also aid decomposition. They add organic nutrients via their fecal matter, and so on. When I was doing research on soil invertebrates distribution at different home gardens in Tabasco, Mexico, I found microplastics. And in those soils with microplastics, they were not earthworms. Experiments, she found that worms attempted to avoid microplastics, but when the soil concentration reached only 7%, they began to ingest them along with the soil, concentrating the plastics in their castings, transporting them through different layers of the soil. In their 2018 paper, Huerta Luanga team cautioned that rainwater flows through earthworm burrows into groundwater, creating a clear conduit for microplastics to enter groundwater systems. She also stated that microplastics cause an 8% to 25% mortality rate in earthworms, depending on how much they ingested. She hypothesized mortality may be partly caused by microplastics abrading the digestive tracts of earthworms, making the more difficult for the organism to absorb the nutrients. If you're scraping down the columnar epithelial cells, it's going to make absorption of these nutrients difficult. Damage to the digestive tracts of earthworms that ingest microplastics has been documented by other researchers. Once microplastics enter an ecosystem, they can proliferate through trophic levels, such as when a bird eats an earthworm or when a person eats an apple. This is called bioaccumulation. Basically, if you have some sort of toxin, it could be a microplastic, it could be a chemical, does not matter. There's a tendency for the level, the concentration to accumulate or increase as you go from trophic level to trophic level. So, and usually it might be measured depending on what the toxin is. It can be measured as in micrograms per gram or per kilogram of body weight, milligrams per kilogram of body weight, whatever. It is usually specified. So let's say you have a zooplankton, and a zooplankton ingesting phytoplankton ingests some toxin. It could be some sort of polyaromatic hydrocarbon, right? Something like that. And it will then concentrate that level. It might be something like, say, 10 micrograms per gram of body weight. Then a fish eats the zooplankton, and that concentrate might increase to, say, 15, 20 micrograms per gram of body weight. And then it eats that, the smaller fish. And then a bird eats that fish, and so on. So by the time you get up to, say, humans, you could have the thing no longer measured in, say, micrograms, but maybe in milligrams per gram of body weight. It's the bioaccumulation, which will then interfere with the physiology of the organisms and causing various issues. It's a poisoning, basically. So there's some really interesting photos here. And let me scroll down to show you the images. Microbe localization in the root, stem, and leaf of a wheat plant. And this is the URL. It gives the credit, effective uptake of sub-micrometer plastics by crop plants via a crack entry mode. Okay. As I said, you can go to this URL, you can click on that, and for further information. So it's very important to note the scale, and the scale is not the same for all these photographs. Okay, this what looks like a little U with a front leading tail. That's a symbol for micro. So this is 200 micrometers or microns. This is 20 microns, right? So the length of the bar, it tells you that's 20 microns, 200 microns. And what's in the box is a plastic, or indicated by the arrow. Okay? So here's 130 micron. This is 10 microns. So if you look at this photo here, you can see that this photo here is a blow up what's in the square here. Right, so here we zoomed in on that square here, and this is where you start seeing these little. It's there. A lot of these photos are doing. They're zooming in to show you the contaminant. So from 200 microns, this is down to 5 microns. That's quite small, the scale there. And then the last one again, we take the square, we zoom in, and there it is. So on. So some very telling photos. Really takes very careful, very thorough examination of the materials. Looking under the microscope to spot these. So it's diligent work. Let's put it that way.
So these photos show zooming in, and if you look within the photos, you can see some of the nanoplastic particles themselves, which get incorporated into the organisms, and then eventually humans will ingest this.
So passing through plant and human tissue. Earlier this year, Yangming Wu, a professor at the Yantai Institute of Coastal Zone Research and the Nanjing Institute of Soil Science in China, and colleagues reported microplastics accumulation in wheat and lettuce plants exposed to microplastics in a laboratory setting. The researchers grew the plants in hydroponic and soil systems with microplastics that had been laced with fluorescent dyes. That helps to track where they end up. The researchers analyzed cross-sections of the plants under a microscope outfitted to detect the fluorescence. The roots, stems, and leaves lit up. I mean, everywhere. For decades, scientists have believed that plastic particles are too large to pass through the physical barriers of intact plant tissue. Our new study disproves this assumption. Those team that the microplastics seem to be entering the plants through cracks in the roots where lateral branching occurs, as well as diffusing through cells at the developing root tips. A team of scientists also reported earlier this year that they had detected plastics in Italian supermarket produce, including carrots, lettuce, broccoli, potatoes, apples, and pears. So here you're thinking, oh, you buy produce because you want to eat in a healthy manner. And look what happens. The researchers wrote that they found the most microplastics contamination in apples and the least in lettuce, speculated that the perennial nature of a fruit tree allowed microplastics to accumulate more than in annual crops. If microplastics are getting into our vegetables, they are getting into everything that eats vegetables, which means they are in our meat and dairy as well. Microplastics have previously been detected in honey, beer, seafood. With clear and uncontrolled pathways into the human food system, ingestion of microplastics by humans is practically unavoidable, but the consequences of ingestion are as of yet unknown. Microfibers have been found in malignant lung tissue biopsies of cancer patients. These plastics were probably inhaled rather than swallowed, but the concern that microplastics can become lodged in tissue and cause dangerous inflammation remains. Studies of mammals forced to ingest microplastics in laboratories have also provided evidence that microplastics can pass through cell walls, move through the body, accumulate in organs, and impact the immune system. Microplastics are chemically active materials capable of attracting and binding to compounds known to harm human health. In addition to cadmium, microplastics have been shown to accumulate lead, PCBs, and pesticides. Yes, I was trying to think of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, earlier with my example of bioaccumulation. Further, plastics are manufactured with their own suite of toxic chemicals, which can include BPA, an endocrine disruptor. Now, this isn't telling because if it's getting into our produce, okay, getting into our produce, we're ingesting this, an endocrine disruptor. There has been seeing some research showing that a lot of the food, including what the big food industry is adding, is making people become obese because they disrupt the endocrine, they disrupt the thyroid gland. This is very troubling. You know, I'm overweight. I'm quite overweight, and I'm basically a vegetarian. I'm eating stuff that's disrupting my endocrine system. Researchers have suggested that both acquired and endogenous compounds could leach out of degrading plastics into their environment, whether that be soil or human tissue or any organism tissue. Because we are concerned with that microplastics may harm our health, we find it interesting that the precautionary principle is not being applied. Sophie Vonk, a researcher at the Plastic Soup Foundation in the Netherlands, group dedicated to ending plastic pollution, told EHN. So as long as there's no proof, we just find it okay that we're being exposed to these particles every single day by our food, water, air we breathe. So there's a photo of various produce. You can see we've got some turnips, artichokes, zucchini, yellow squash, looks like eggplant, a whole bunch of things. So what to do? Since microplastics enter agricultural system through a variety of means, addressing this issue would require a multi-tiered approach. The Plastic Soup Foundation has a long-standing campaign to eliminate the use of plastic microbeads in personal care products. This would likely reduce the amount of plastics that ends up in sewage sludge. The group also supports limiting single-use plastics generally, as these will ultimately break down to microplastics that end up polluting both ocean and terrestrial environments. Think of the plastic straws at the fast food joints as an example. We're not anti-plastic. We feel like plastic can be very useful for certain purposes, but the way we're using it now is just really, really not clever. The European Chemicals Agency has proposed an EU-wide ban on intentionally introduced microplastics, including those in personal care products, as well as slow-release fertilizer and seed coating used in agriculture. Some states in the U.S. have also moved to ban microbeads from personal care products. Typical state versus federal government battle in the U.S. This is the kind of thing where you need a mandate from the federal level. To address the plastic mulch issue, Nizzetto said that one helpful step would be to make companies that manufacture plastic mulch films responsible for the recycling and disposal. This would help reduce inappropriate disposal at farms. The use of biodegradable plastics for mulch has also been proposed, but these polymers potentially come with their own set of problems. For instance, one of Huerta Luanga's studies found that the biodegradable plastic negatively impacted wheat growth more than a conventional plastic used in the study. Also, there's been controversy over whether some quote-unquote biodegradable plastics actually degrade into harmless compounds, or whether they just simply break down into microplastics faster. In other words, they degrade into smaller bits, but the chemical compounds that make up the item stays intact. There's no breakdown of the chemical compounds into less toxic forms. Such controversy surrounds oxo biodegradable plastic, which the EU moved to ban in 2019. Another alternative to plastics, mulch, developed by researchers at the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, involves growing nutrient sequestering cover crops and then rolling them down to form a thick mat. Farmers then plant into the mat, which itself persists and inhibits weeds, lets water through, adds nutrients instead of microplastics to the soil. According to the researchers' report, the technique can replace more than 90 pounds of plastic mulch per acre. That certainly sounds really promising. But this is not my area of expertise, but on the face of it, that sounds good. Gladys Zanatti, director of the Vegetable Systems Trial at Rodale and co-author on the report, told EHN that the strategy is scalable to large farms and emphasized the importance of building up healthy soils and farmland to support long-term resiliency. Much more research is needed to paint a complete picture of the scope and impacts of microplastic pollution of agricultural soil. But in the meantime, plastics will continue to accumulate. This is a kind of irreversible contamination, said Nizzetto. There's no way to remediate this kind of contamination at the scale of agricultural soils. So what it appears to be is that research is trying to find ways to prevent further, but what's there is already there. So this is, I wanted to bring you this information. This is critical. It affects us all. We all eat something, right? You know, whether you're a strict carnivore, an omnivore, a vegetarian, herbivore, whatever. It seems like everything we eat, we're getting plastics into our system. And so this is important information. And as I said, this is following the plastic issue is something I told you guys I keep you up to date on. And so we moved from the oceanic realm to the agricultural realm. This is the latest in that. Some important research being done. Kudos to all the scientists doing the research and working on this issue. Thank you for your time. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk. asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.